Today's message I have entitled The Paradox of Weakness. And obviously when we were having our communion together, I already highlighted it a little bit. How can you look at the cross and see the strength in it if you don't really understand it? You will probably see it as just a poor man that was dying for a very strange reason. But if you understand really what's behind it, that even though it may appear to be weak, it's actually God's strength. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever heard of the word Australianness? Have you? No, it's a bit of a funny word, isn't it? It simply means something like this. What makes an Australian an Australian? What is a characteristic of an Australian? That's a very difficult task, isn't it? I mean, if I just look at it here, many of us have Australian passports, but they also have passports from another country, different cultures. So understanding Australian is very difficult. But I think it's important for us to understand a little bit. In the 3 years that I'm now living in Australia, I have made many discoveries about what Australia is all about. And I'm still discovering in many ways. So what is Australianness? Well, I'll give you a couple of them, and probably you'll recognize them. It's this idea of mateship. Hey, mate! I cannot even say it, but like all around the world, people will say it, hey, mate. But the concept of hey, mate, that is very rich. It means something very precious to the Australian heart, right? Something else of Australian is hard work. Remember, the early settlers that came here many years ago, they didn't have an easy life. It was very tough. And for the generations after as well, not just those from Europe, also those from Asia, South America, Africa, many other nations. They came here, but they also realized to make it happen here, you had to work hard. Another characteristic of Australianness is probably multiculturalism. Well, I just need to look at your faces and I can tick off that box. It's a very easy one to see, that one. What about this one? This, I think, was a very interesting one. Another characteristic of Australianness is humility. Australians don't like to be perceived as the know-alls and the arrogant brags that kind of like dominate other nations or other people. At least that's not what they want to be. That's why a lot of Australians, they say that they want to give everyone a fair go. It is so embedded in the culture because we all understand, you know what? It wasn't always easy to come here, whether as an immigrant, well, most of us here are immigrants anyway, and we understand that when we do life, we need to do it together, so we might as well treat each other fairly and to give each other a fair go. We cut down the tall poppy. Do you know that expression? That person that likes to stick its head a bit above the sand and think that he is perhaps better than the others. And we aggrandize the Australian, the Aussie battler, the underdog. I don't know about you, but when for instance, I see the match between the West Coast Eagles and the Fremantle Dockers, I immediately cheer for the Fremantle Dockers. There is some Australianness inside of me that's like, you know what? I know they will probably lose. I'm charging it here a little bit, right, Graham? But it's important to understand there is something in the Australian spirit that has a soft spot for the underdog, the weak in some ways. Because they want to treat everybody equally. And that's probably something very important for us to understand. I come from a nation where that is very similar as well. You raise your neck a little bit above the sand and cha! They make sure that everybody is equal. They don't like hierarchy at all. In that sense, for me to adjust to Australian culture wasn't that much of a stretch. But here is the thing. We talk about equality. But we also understand that life doesn't always treat us equally, does it? There are sometimes moments in our lives that we perhaps look at other people and we see that they are better off, whether it's financially or socially. And we wonder why we don't get our, share of the pie, so to speak. Life isn't always fair, it seems. Even though we want to give each other a fair go and be part of a society where we are not trying to push people down, the reality often shows that life is hard, life is difficult. And even more so for those that want to follow Jesus Christ. It seems that sometimes our life as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus Christ, is marked by so many paradoxes. We just celebrated one. We are celebrating weakness here. Did you think of that before like that? I had never thought, never seen it that way for many years. I'm like, this is something about something beautiful that we are celebrating together. But what we're actually celebrating is that it pleased Jesus to become weak, because he came to us in the form of a human being. He laid down his glory. He was in heaven. He was equal with the Father, but he came down because he wanted to save us from ourselves, from sin. And that's a big discovery for us to understand, that the walk we have with our Lord is very often marked by paradoxes, things that sometimes don't seem to match very well. The weak, they are strong. The strong, they are weak. The little, they are big. The big, they are small. The rich, they are poor. The poor, they are rich. In the economy of God, and here's perspective on earth, on us human beings, it's very strange. There is something upside down about the reality of a Christian, of walking with the Lord. Somebody that had to learn that the hard way very much was the Apostle Paul. He was a Pharisee. Now, when we say Pharisee, we immediately think of a hypocrite. Somebody two-faced, say one thing, does another. But in those days, a Pharisee was understood as somebody with a lot of zeal and respect for God. They were the evangelists that would go out and try to, save the world maybe in a very charged way. And Paul was one of the best ones. He was a scholar. He had read the Bible. He probably could quote it, the words, the verses, the chapters entirely. He was trained that way, and he was fighting against this Christian sect that was saying that there was another Lord, that was Jesus Christ, and he started to persecute the church. You probably have heard the story. You can read it in in Acts of the Apostles. But then it eventually came to the time that Jesus revealed himself also to Paul, and he showed, listen, why are you persecuting me? Your zeal for my cause is blinding you so that you cannot even see who I really am. That was the start of a new call and a new life for Paul, where he realized that it wasn't all about zeal and being powerful and being in a position to start dominate other people. He had to learn it the hard way. As a matter of fact, God already told through, I think it was Barnabas, the guy that started to pray for Paul so that he could receive his eyesight back again. You can read it in Acts, I believe chapter 9. And it was in that time that Paul realized, listen, I cannot live the way that I used to live. And he realized that God's power and his presence could only flow through a place of weakness. And he wrote a very important epistle, letter, to the Corinthians, where he says this. You will see it on the screen as well. It says in 2 Corinthians 12, verse 9 and 10, and I'm reading it from another version this time, then it's probably on the screen, but just bear with me. It says this, and he has said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, I will rather boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore I am well content with weaknesses, with insults, with distresses, with persecution, with difficulties for Christ's sake. For when I'm weak, then I am strong. It sounds so beautiful, doesn't it? But doesn't it sound also like a great paradox to live by this way? Just to think about it. If you look, for instance, at the life of Jesus when he came, he said things like, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." And then he flips it upside down and shows what the good effect of it, of living that way. He says, for instance, Jesus also said, "Blessed are the meek, the humble, for they shall inherit the earth." He is showing straight off the bat that the Christian life, walking with the Lord, is a life that seems to not make sense. It's an upside down reality. And Paul had to realize it and experience it firsthand very much. Now, I mentioned a little bit in the beginning about the Australian spirit, mateship, treating each other equally. And there was another word that I used that was humility. Humility. I think a great part of understanding the paradox of weak power in weakness means coming to terms with a good understanding of what humility is. You see, Jesus himself said in Matthew chapter 11, he said something really interesting. And I want you to pay attention here. "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." Basically, Jesus was saying this: come to me because I am humble. That's what he was saying, right? Now let me ask you, would you consider yourself a humble person? All of a sudden people look a little bit like, I need to be careful. I don't want to be appearing prideful here, so no, I would never say that about myself, right? It's interesting that Jesus is saying, listen, you wanna find that rest for your soul? Come to me, because I am humble. Probably people today will say, Jesus, isn't that a little bit arrogant to say? What about this one? One of the most humble persons on earth, Moses. He wrote this. He wrote this himself. In Numbers 12:3, it says this: "Now the man Moses was very humble, more than all men who were on the face of the earth." Would you consider Moses here a very humble person? In Aussie standards, we would probably shoot the tall poppy here and say, like, "Moses, get off your high horse here." Makes sense, doesn't it? Our perception of humility is like they are talking about it just like that. That begs sometimes the question, what are we talking about here? What are we talking about when we think about weakness? When we see it in the life of Paul, the life of Jesus, the life of Moses. I want to make three very simple points. Today it's going to be actually quite a short message. People are saying, "Amen, brother." Yes. The first point I would like to make has to do with the perception of weakness. Let me read this. This comes from a pastor, Charles Stanley. He says this: "No one enjoys feeling weak, whether it is emotionally, spiritually, or physically. There is something within the human spirit that wants to resist the thought of weakness. Many times this is nothing more than our human pride at work. Just as weakness carries a great potential for strength, pride carries an equally great potential for defeat." You see, we don't mind to talk about weakness. Yeah, of course, I need to humble myself and be before the Lord. But very often, we might have the tendency when I ask, "So how are you doing?" And all of a sudden, whoop, the appearance comes up. And all of a sudden, you don't want to be perceived necessarily as a weak, struggling person. I remember when I grew up, the people in class was like, boys don't cry. Have you heard that one? You need to show some strength there. Don't start crying and showing off all your emotions of stuff, or are you a sissy? I hear Mason already saying amen, brother. Yes. Yeah. But here's the thing. Weakness and humility are often very much misunderstood. Paul, very often, he wrote to people and said, like, listen, I have a boldness to share the gospel with people around me. I'm not ashamed of it. But it's not that I'm a better person than you are. I simply know who is living inside of me. It is him that I am boasting in, not in my own strength, in my own self-efforts. And that's very important to understand, because humility in the natural, when we look at each other, the horizontal relationships, remember, the relationship with God, the relationship with each other, because we often don't want to be appearing as prideful, what do we usually do? We throw ourselves a little bit down. It's like, oh well, I'm also just a struggling person. I'm a bad sinner and everything, but thank God that He saved me. And that might sound very humble and very nice, but often it is also to make sure that people around us have a certain perception of you that is not real. Let me give you a very simple example for you to make this clear. When you go on a job interview, who likes a job interview here? Raise your hands. Nobody. All right. I have done many job interviews in my life on both sides, being the interviewer or the interviewee. And one of the questions that I either receive or I would ask it for sure myself is like, so David, can I use you as an example? All right, yeah, that's the problem, man. Yeah, I know. What would you consider one of your greatest strengths? Your study and good looks. There you go. I know he would give an answer, so that's beautiful. But now I would go to the second question. David, what would you consider as one of your greatest weaknesses? Your temper. Oh, you're very honest about it, and that's a great thing. We all understand that, and particularly in job interviews, that's very important to hear, is because we want to have people working with us that at least they're aware of their own blind spots, right? You don't want to be working with people that you ask them a question, so what is your greatest weakness? And it's like, weakness? I don't think I have any weakness. Would you like to work with a person like that? Yeah, sure. Absolutely not. You see, we need to be aware, obviously, of where we fall short, of where we need other people in our lives. I have certain areas in being a pastor that I know I need help from other people. It's simply not a strong area in my life. That keeps me humble in many ways. We all understand that we are called as one body, interdependent of each other, not independent, but interdependent. We need each other because that is how the body is supposed to function, right? But here it comes. Often weakness and humility are misunderstood in the natural. I was reminded of a story of King David before he was the king. When he enters the scene and he sees this big giant called Goliath, just before that scene, he was already anointed as the king, and all his brothers knew it. And he was one of the youngest ones. And actually, one of the older brothers thought that he would become the king, but Samuel, the prophet, said like, no, it's not going to be you, it's going to be David, it's going to be somebody else, a man after God's heart. And now the scene is that the army of Israel is fighting, and this big Goliath is standing there taunting the Israelites, saying like, try to fight me, try to go against me. And after a couple of weeks, this is going on for weeks, David, he wasn't yet king, comes on the scene, and he sees what is in front of him, and something stirs inside of him, a boldness, where he says something like, who is this uncircumcised, uncircumcised Philistine, that he is, to defy the God of Israel. And his brothers are seeing that scene. You know what they say about David? Instead of welcoming him in and like, oh, brother, good to see you. One of his brothers says something like this. Yeah, I know why you came here. You came here just to check us out, right? How bad we're doing here. I know what's going on inside of you. You have a lot of iniquity, sin in your heart. You're a bad person. Sometimes people misunderstand boldness. They think it's arrogance. They think it's something very different. In my culture, Australian culture as well, it's often perceived that way. When Christians stand and they proclaim something with boldness and with faith, a lot of people immediately think, oh, that's a super Christian. Be careful with those. You want to stay away from them. They think they're better than the rest. That's not where boldness comes from. Boldness comes obviously from understanding that we are saved by grace. We are not strong in ourselves. And that brings me to my second point to understand, and that's about the price of weakness. It's usually God that uses people that first have been broken themselves. It's first people that are broken by God, by circumstances of life, that God can flow through with his power. I have shared many times about stuff that happened in my life, whether it was depression, whether it were my struggles, whether it were my defeats. For some people, that people can become very uncomfortable with that. Because I think like a pastor, you're the pastor. You're supposed to have a certain appearance. But here's the thing, and the same thing was true for Paul as well. He didn't mind to boast, like, I'm going through persecution, I'm going through hardship, I'm going through all kind of things, danger and sleeplessness and all of that stuff. And you know what? I'm glad I have all of that stuff because it makes me dependent on the grace of God. And our human nature fights against that, doesn't it? For instance, if I would call you, I remember yesterday, Jude went with us and Tar on the streets to evangelize. And obviously, I remember the first time I went out on the streets to evangelize, I was so afraid. I was so scared to think of what are people going to think of me? What if people are going to say, call me bad names or worse? You feel so dependent then all of a sudden, not just on the people around you, right? But for sure on God. It's like, I can't do it myself. It's important to understand when God calls you to do something, he's not calling you because you are qualified. He's just calling you, and he will make sure that he can qualify you by you simply being dependent on him. I have seen many times in my life, I remember I started out as a children's pastor, hardly speaking Portuguese, with my guitar and my best intentions, in front of a screaming group of about 40 kids that didn't necessarily want to listen to a man. Most of them were women that were leading that ministry. And it was in that time, in the very beginning, I got very sick. My gallbladder needed to be removed. I was super sick in that time. Needed to have a surgery and all of that stuff. It was in that time that we had a vacation Bible school. A vacation Bible school. It was in the very beginning of the ministry. I just had the surgery. I just came back. The leader, together with me, she left. She's like, you know what? I don't want to lead this ministry anymore. Good luck with it. And she left me with it. And it's like, okay, how am I going to go about on it now? A few weeks passed by. It was right before Vacation Bible School. And 150 kids showed up the first day. And I looked at Janine, and Janine looked at me and said, like, well, we're going to go through this by the grace of God. And so we did. We were so aware of how dependent we were on God. But the amazing thing was as well that God did amazing things to the lives of these kids. Sometimes you don't always see that, right? You minister to the children and you wonder if later on in life they're going to pick up on something. I see now it's been almost 15 years later, and I see some of them having become pastors. I see some of them being very firm and very strong in a ministry. Already married right now. But back then, oh, they were the bad boys and bad girls. They weren't exactly listening to Pastor Patrick. Or they would call it in Portuguese, Pastor Patricky. That's how they would call me. I felt so humbled by that experience. I realized, like, you know what? I don't have the intelligence to pull this off. I don't have it. As a matter of fact, I don't even have that much experience with children. How am I going to do this? But it is in this place where we find strength. Because if we still think we can cling on to something that we can try to figure it out, if I do this step, then that will happen, and then everything will be okay. We realize that, and it's not just with ministry, it's with our lives as well. Have you noticed, and I'm talking here to the husbands and wives here, that you cannot fix each other? You cannot fix each other, guys, girls. It's impossible. You don't have that power. You wish you had, perhaps. Oh, I could shoot him off his high horse again. Well, guess what? Where you're sitting. You understand what I'm saying? Like when you're in a place of weakness, when you understand, like, you know what, only God can change that person. And I can just love that person for who he or she is. Let that be enough. It comes with a price, doesn't it? It comes with a price. We experience God's power. We experience the power of the great comforter when we are first in a place of great discomfort. Christianity can never be a comfortable religion. It has never been about that. As a matter of fact, all the followers of Jesus Christ, most of them were killed. The first apostles, they were all killed, minus one, John the Apostle who wrote Revelation. They all understood what it meant to live from a power, but actually live from a place of total, utter dependence on God. And that brings me to my final point, and that is the place of weakness. James chapter 4, verse 6 and 7, it says this, but he gives more grace. Therefore he says, God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Therefore, submit yourself to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. You know, often in our struggles in life, it is in our submission to God where we say, like, you know what, God, I will follow you. It's hard right now. I'm experiencing pain in my life. But I also know when I place myself under your authority, you will lift me up. He did with me in the children's ministry years ago that I thought, like, you know, I can see it. When I left that church 6 years later, and I saw so many people, they never told me. It's interesting that people sometimes keep thinking like, oh, Pastor Patrick is leaving. All of a sudden, all kind of stories popped up. It had nothing to do with my glory and me being a great pastor. It had nothing to do with that. But they were so touched by certain things that I said over the course of time. Never realized it. Never ever realized it. Does it mean that makes me a great pastor? It has nothing to do with that. It has to do everything to do with God, who works through a place of complete dependence. As we submit to him, his power becomes manifest. But here is the thing, and this is probably the hard part. To place ourselves in that position of weakness, we need to stop comparing among each other. Sometimes when you feel bad about yourself, let's say you had a terrible day, it's so easy to get in that role of playing the victim. Because it's in playing the victim you hope that the other person then will try to lift you up. Look what happens here. All of a sudden, you try to feel better about yourself, not because of God, but because of a so-called attention from the other. When people are going through hard times, of course it's great that you can wrap your hands around him right now with coronavirus. It's a little bit difficult, but that you can come close and to cheer them up, and that's a great thing. But we all understand when people are trying to manipulate that stuff and immediately go into the role of the victim. Have you ever seen that? People that constantly want to show weak, just to call for attention, just to make sure that they are seen. That is not the place of weakness that Paul is talking about. Our love and our affection is already established when Jesus Christ said, "It is accomplished. It is finished. It's a done deal." To live by comparison by people around us, it's a big trap. It's a prison to live in. Nowadays, a lot of the stuff that's going on around us is probably defined because we only look at each other. We don't look at God. Yesterday I was watching a movie called Freedom Riders. Probably some may have seen it already. It's a real story. It happens in Long Beach, California. After the riots of Rodney King in '92, many people of different gangs, they fought each other, and over 120 people were murdered in a very short period of time. A little bit after that, a teacher comes to the scene to a school where they have a policy of integration, and they kind of forcefully try to get people from Asian background and African background and other backgrounds together, and everybody is fighting each other. Why? Because they only can look at the color of people's skin. They are of this clan, they are of that clan. And they never can come to the point of understanding that it has never been about color or race. In the United States, and it's not just in the United States, it's in many countries, many places. We don't like to be pushed down. We don't like to be in the place of weakness at the expense, where the other is living at the expense of the other person. And it was so obvious that this teacher that was trying to teach them, listen, it's not about the color of your skin. It's about simply you seeing the other person for he or she really is. That started to change something. I highly recommend you to watch it. It's quite strong to watch it, but it's very powerful. It shows probably a way forward for a lot of the stuff that's going on around the world. It wasn't obviously a Christian movie. For us as Christians, we understand we don't come from the place of strength. We come from the place of weakness. Over 50 years ago, there were two black African-American leaders, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. They died one shortly after the other. Both were assassinated. But their approach to a different society was completely different. Where Malcolm X wanted to show that black people had power and that they could show that they were worthy of something, and that those white people that were domineering them for ages, he would show them. And then on the other side, there was Martin Luther King. Far from a perfect person. He had his issues as well. But his approach through non-violence, which obviously reflects also what Jesus would be standing for, marked actually something totally different. Now, a lot of people in those days, they thought like that Martin Luther King was a weak person. Can't you see that they're standing on our soul, that they're picking on us? Many people today have that still. Regardless of background. Doesn't matter what the color of your skin is. Joshua, in a school in the Netherlands, that was primarily people from an African background. He said, I experience racism as well. For as strange as it sounds. Doesn't make sense, does it? There are no stereotypes here about how it should look like. As long as we look at each other just horizontally thinking like, oh, you're doing better than I am, so my clan, we're gonna get you. We're gonna do something against you. That's the world we're living in. And God is calling us to live in a place of weakness. Because when we live in a place of weakness and dependence on God, things start to shift. We start to look at each other. Remember, the place of reconciliation. From now on, we don't regard anyone according to the flesh. But that's the last thing sometimes we do. We often first look at each other and it's like, what, there is something wrong with you. You're so different. You have such a cultural strangeness in you. Like, I don't like what I'm seeing here. The only way forward in a world that is so broken by race wars and ethnic difficulties, is to start living from this place of weakness. I am glad I don't have it all together. I don't have all the answers to everything. And I'm glad for that, because it makes me dependent on other people around me, and even more than that, it makes me dependent on God. Regardless of what you might be going through this morning in your life, maybe you look at yourself and you see yourself as not a very strong Christian. You're struggling a lot. That's not a bad place to be. That's a good place to be. As long as you don't compare yourself to people around you, but you place yourself, you know what? I am in God's presence. He sees me for what I am, and I can overcome, not in my own strength, but in His. Amen? Thank you so much. I will ask the musicians to come. Living free means living free from comparisons all the time, whether we do that in our mind or we say it out loud. We don't need the appreciation for others just to feel good about ourselves. It doesn't work that way. When we're in the place of weakness, we understand that we are already loved and that we are very special in God's eyes. Reminds me, as a final example, of a man called Nick Vujicic. How do you call his name? Vujicic. Vujicic, there you go. For those of you who don't know him, the man without arms and legs, an Australian American. What I found out about this man, that he, besides the fact that he's a motivational speaker and he speaks in many secular contexts as well, this man without limbs, no arms, no legs, nothing, in the natural, he would be considered extremely weak. And that's how he saw himself for many, many years. As a matter of fact, when he was 10 years old, he filled up the bathtub and he wanted to kill himself by just throwing himself in. Remember, no arms, no feet, drowning in the water. He didn't see life as something good any longer. He didn't die that day. As a matter of fact, that was one of the days that marked his life so much. And he started to realize over time, as people were ministering to his heart, that God loved him so dearly. Later on, I think he was only 17 years old, he started his own foundation as he received invitations to speak about his life, just his testimony. He got invitations to schools, public places, probably even governments, where he was sharing his life story. And one of the things he always said, never give up. Even when you feel weak and people perceive you as being weak, it is in that place where God can be so strong in your life. He didn't say that he had it all together. In the natural, people would, if you wouldn't know his story, you would look at him and probably roll with those eyes like, what is that? But in God's eyes, it was completely different. Nick Vujicic, very difficult name for me. He learned to live from the place of weakness. That's a daily struggle. Our human nature tends to want to live our lives the way we want to live it. And of course, God wants you to make your own choices. He gave you a free will as well. That doesn't mean that anything goes and you can just live your life the way you always understand it. We need to be dependent on God. In our ministries, in our jobs, we don't always have it together. Sometimes there are days that you're like, oh, why did I say that thing to that person? Don't you have that sometimes? Oh, I shouldn't have said that. Instead of beating yourself up and making yourself like a miserable worm, why don't you just go back to that place of weakness and like, God, help me. Just help me. If you need to ask for forgiveness, ask for forgiveness. No worries there. God is growing something inside of you and me that will become so powerful and so strong that it will be a testimony for the world around us. Amen. He's not looking for perfect Christians. He's looking for real people. Amen.